Across 5 Aprils by Irene Hunt. Day 5. Sometimes the wagon wheels sank deep in the mud of a low, wet spot along the road. Now and then a wheel passed over a stone or a stump hidden by weeds or tangled vines, and the wagon with its load tilted precariously. Jethro maintained the stoic calm of the farm-bred boy as the wagon swayed. He kept his small, hunched frame in a position of untroubled assurance, whistling a little now and then to prove to himself that his nerves were as nearly iron-like as he wanted to believe they were. A quarter of a mile beyond the wood stretch, the road led past the Burdo place. The name, so closely associated with Mary's death, was one that was never mentioned at home, and was perhaps more evil to Jethro by the very fact that it was so carefully shunned. That morning, as he looked at the sagging roofs of the house and barn, the general clutter of the ne'er-do-well in the barnyard, he felt a dread as if some evil lay close to the ground on its belly and peered out at him. The physical dangers of the road through the woods he could meet calmly, but his heart pounded as he looked toward the Burdo place, and he urged his team to a trot until they were well beyond it. It was nearly 11 o'clock when he drove into Newton, the weather-beaten old county seat lying on the cliffs above the Embarrass River. In the summer, soft skies, hundreds of full-leaf trees, and the winding river combined to give the little town an air of grace, a trace of charm that surmounted the basic ugliness. On that morning in late March when Jethro drove into town, there was no beauty in Newton to soften the view of muddy streets and the stark bleakness of bare trees and unpainted box-like cabins. But there were people moving up and down the wooden sidewalks, smokes rising from 200 or 300 chimneys, and for a boy accustomed to the loneliness of an isolated farm, the gentle bustle of the place was exciting and full of wonder. The town was built around a square in the manner of Midwestern county seats, with the jail dominating the center. This was a small log building without doors, where the occupants made their reluctant entrance by way of a trap door in the roof. On the 4 sides of the square surrounding the jail, there were 2 feed stores, a harness shop, 2 general stores, a newspaper office, and 3 saloons. There was a restaurant, too, where cooking was done over an iron stove instead of a fireplace. Jethro had eaten there once when he had come to town with Bill and Shadrach. It had been a wonderful experience, and he looked at the place wistfully as he passed. His father, of course, would never consider spending good money for the extravagance of eating in a restaurant, and Jenny had placed an apple in her brother's pocket together with a slice of pork between 2 pieces of cornbread for his noon meal. Well, one did not quarrel with the food which he was blessed to receive, but one could not help sighing a little at the good things of life with which he was not blessed. Down on the river, at the outskirts of town, there was the mill, where Jethro drove first and bargained with the grain according to his father's instructions. Later, at Gardner's general store, the chickens were weighed in exchange for the calico and thread that Jenny wanted and mittens for himself. With the money from the corn, he bought first the coffee, 10 pounds of sleek, plump beans in a heavy canvas bag, then the sugar, nails, axle handle, and tobacco. He watched Sam Gardner bring out a can of coal oil for another customer and guard against the possibility of the oils splashing out by fixing a lump of gumdrop candy over the spout. The waste of such precious material cut Jethro like a knife. Maybe Sam Gardner understood the look on the boy's face. At all events, he scooped up a handful of gumdrops and put them in the package with the other things. A half-dozen men sat around the fireplace at one end of the store or leaned against the counters and cracker barrels. Jethro recognized Ross Milton, the red-head editor of the county paper. Milton was crippled with arthritis, and his face had lines of suffering in it, but Jethro noticed that his voice was crisp and decisive, and that there was an air of assurance about him that set him apart from the other men. He was watching the editor curiously when suddenly the name Burdo struck his ears, and he realized that a silent, burly giant of a man on the outer edge of the circle was the father of Travis Burdo. The man looked as if he had lived in filth for a lifetime, and Jethro felt a loathing that was new to him. He tried not to look in Burdo's direction, but time and again his eyes went back, even at the cost of a great unrest inside him. The men paid little attention to Jethro as he made his purchases. Finally, though, one of them slapped the boy's leg playfully with a folded newspaper when he approached the group for one of the items on his list. "What might your name be, son?" he asked cheerfully. "I'm Matt Creighton's boy. Name's Jethro." Some of the men glanced at Dave Burdo, who started slightly at the name and stared at Jethro from small, deep-set eyes. "Well, young Creighton, is your pa in town with you today?" the first speaker asked casually after a short silence. "No, sir. I brought the team in by myself." Jethro cleared his throat self-consciously. "It wasn't any trouble for me at all," he added. Some of the men around the fire grinned broadly, and Jethro saw one of them wink at the man next to him. Dave Burdo did not grin. Neither did another red-faced young man, who had put his foot on the rung of a chair and now leaned forward a little, looking coldly at Jethro. "Seeing your pa ain't here to answer, I wonder if you'd be of mind to tell us where your brother Bill is these days. Some folks around here allows he's down south, shooting our boys alongside the Rebs. Is it your understanding that's what he's doing?" "We ain't heard from Bill since he left," Jethro answered. His eyes were wide in his thin face. "Well, now, that's a purty answer," the man sneered. "Only trouble is that it don't quite satisfy a lot of us." He turned suddenly to look across the store at Burdo. "You know, Dave, Matt Creighton talked the boys into sparing Travis's worthless hide a couple years ago. If Bill Creighton ever shows his face around these parts again, maybe you'll have the chance to talk us into sparing him." Burdo didn't look at the man. He gathered up some bags of groceries and walked out of the store stiffly, almost as if he expected a blow in the back. The editor struggled to get his crutches under his arms. "Another shot of whiskey, Wortman, and maybe you'll have spunk enough to pick on someone who can fight back. You know that Burdo hasn't a friend in the county, so you're safe in giving him a kick. I might add that tormenting a young boy doesn't take either courage or brains." Another man spoke up. "All right, Red, so the boy's just a kid. I'm not for tormenting, but I'm ready to let him know that a lot of folks around here take it pretty dim that Bill Creighton hightailed it off to the Rebs." "Then let folks keep their quarrel with Bill. Matt has 2 or 3 sons in the Union Army. Why should he and his family suffer for Bill's action? If the editor of the county paper ain't in freedom of speech, could I just put one more question to this young'un?" Without waiting for a reply, the man called Wortman turned again to Jethro. "What I want to ask you is this. Is your pa good and down on Bill? Does he teach your brother as a skunk that deserves shooting for going against his country?" Jethro felt a great weakness. He had to steady himself against the counter for a second. When he spoke, the words were the first ones that occurred to him. "My pa don't teach me one way or the other. He knows that I think more of my brother than anybody else in the world, no matter where he is. And that's all I got to say to you." He looked directly at the man with an anger that dissipated his weakness. Somebody clapped, and Guy Wortman's face grew vicious. He took a step toward Jethro, but one of the men caught his arm. "So he's a great man, is he? Reb lover or not, he's the best man you ever knowed?" He spun fiercely toward the man who held his arm. "What's the matter with you, Ben Harris? You got a copperhead streak in you, too? Folks around here are so all fired sure that Matt Creighton is a solid citizen. Well, I ask you to notice that he's not talking down his ornery traitor of a son to young smart Aleck here." There was a whiteness around the editor's mouth as he slapped a crumpled hat on his red head. "There isn't trouble enough in this country for you, is there, Guy? You'd better get out and do your patriotic duty. Kick up some more mob violence. That's your forte, you know. Get in on any killing you can drum up, so long as your own hide is safe." Sam Gardner, standing behind his counter, nodded at Milton's words. His round face was troubled, and he cleared his throat several times before he spoke. "I go along with what Red says, Guy. There ain't any big reason, or great big reason that I know of, why you can't join up yourself instead of loafing around drunk in my store. Maybe you'd ought to keep that mouth of yours shut a little tighter, Sam. You and Red Milton, both of you." Guy Wortman stood glaring at the storekeeper a moment, and then added, "I'm getting out of your store. I ain't saying what else I'm doing, but I'm getting out." "I'm going with you, Guy," one of the men said, getting to his feet. He turned belligerently when he reached the door. "I got no use for the thieving Burdos," he said, as if a sudden idea had to be aired before he left. "But I'll say this, Trav Burdo is a Union soldier. I don't think you'd round up a mob so easy to go on agin him if it was a matter between Trav and the Creightons this year." He went outside, then closed upon Wortman's heels. The editor stood facing the other men in the store with rage in his eyes. Sam Gardner went over and laid his hand on Milton's shoulder. "Now calm down, Red. They ain't neither one of them worth shooting, you know that. They ain't worth another one of them heart attacks of yourn." He turned then to Jethro, who stood beside the counter, his body hunched together as if in an effort to make himself as inconspicuous as possible. "I'm sorry that you've had to hear mean talk like this, son. It was bad, all round bad, but you done right to stand up for your brother. I might not like what Bill done, but I can't help feeling you was right in standing up for him." "Yes, sir," Jethro nodded weakly and began gathering up his bundles. "You starting for home soon, young Creighton?" That was the editor. "As soon as I load up and get my team watered and fed." Milton threw himself forward between his crutches. "Come on, then. I'll have one of the boys in my office look after your team. Let's get these things put away in your wagon." Jethro was shaking inside when he walked out of the store into the pale sunlight. The editor drew a long breath as if he were very tired, but he smiled when Jethro looked up at him. I wanted a chance to get better acquainted with you, Creighton. I knew Bill a little. He and young Yale used to come in and talk to me sometimes when they came to town. I liked them. They was good friends, Jethro said quietly. I was real close to both of them. They carried his parcels down to the wagon and stored them in the wagon bed. 15 minutes later, they were back at the newspaper office, where a young man sat reading, his feet propped up on the table before him. Charlie, I wonder if you'd do me the favor of taking this boy's team down to the livery stable for water and feed. I'm asking him to have dinner with me. The young man got to his feet, grinning. Sure, Red. Glad to oblige. Here you've been blowing off at that mouth at some of the Cracker Barrel heroes again. Milton shrugged. Words get around fast. Ben Harris was in for a minute. The young man shook his head. You just ain't going to be happy till you get dressed up in tar and feathers, are you, Red? There are some people I don't admire much, Charlie. I've learned that by talking with you just a little. Well, he pulled on a jacket as he spoke. Where's the team? Hitched down in front of the restaurant. I count this a real favor you're doing young Creighton and me, Charlie. Glad to help any friend of yours, Red. Charlie winked at Jethro in a friendly way and went out into the street. Jethro glanced at the editor timidly. I brought some dinner with me, Mr. Milton. You don't need to go to the expense of buying me a restaurant meal. I know, but I don't like to eat alone, and anyway, a boy who has made a long trip as you have needs something warm in his stomach. Come on, Mrs. Hiles usually has apple pie for dessert. The restaurant was warm and clean, full of the fragrance of roasting meat, freshly baked wheat flour bread, and strong, rich coffee. Jethro's fears began to fade before the hunger he felt the minute they set foot inside the place. When a plump, pink-cheeked woman placed a plate heaped with meat and vegetables in front of him with a wedge of pie at one side, he couldn't find it in his heart to be irritated at the fond hand she ran across his curls. All the Creightons has got looks, she says, when the editor introduced Jethro. Then she slapped Milton on the shoulder and added amiably, I always said you ought to have been a family man, Red. You're a very astute woman, Lily. But like most of us, you have your blind spots. What sort of life would a family of mine have with the old man in hot water 3/4 of the time? She nodded caustically at that and stood surveying the two of them for a moment, her hands on her wide hips. I guess you got something there, editor. Well, call me if your appetite's ain't satisfied, she added, walking away. Ross Milton turned to Jethro. Now then, young Creighton, what sort of boy are you? Can you read? Jethro's voice had a slight edge. Yes, sir, I can. Shad left his books for my sister and me. Right now I'm reading a history of the American Revolution. The editor nodded briefly. Any heroes? Any particular man who interests you most? Jethro thought for a minute. Maybe it's because Shad told me so much about him. I don't know. Somehow, the man that interests me most is Tom Paine. Milton's face lighted with a big smile. Really? The writer, the man of ideas? That's good. He stirred his coffee several times and seemed to be waiting. Well, anything else? He asked after a time. I'm beginning to get the hang of the newspapers a little better. Me and my sister is reading them together. Shad wants us to. Young Yale has quite a lot of influence with you, eh? He was a real fine teacher. Milton nodded. Well, you're lucky to have had a teacher you really liked. I hated most of mine like poison when I was a boy. I think they returned the compliment, too. There was one, though, old Doc Bailey. He had a wooden leg, and he used to storm around the schoolhouse like a mad elephant. Old Doc was all right, though. He was the first man who taught me to respect the king's English. You mean he learned you how to talk good? Well, he tried. At least he made me sensitive to a lot of very bad English I heard all around me. When you have your skull thumped every time you say fit for fought and heerd for heard, you might become a bit more alert, Creighton. You even grow a little critical and want to thump some skulls yourself. Jethro was sober. Shad corrected his son. But I guess I had too many other things to learn us. I'd like to talk nice, the way you and him do, he added. The editor looked at him thoughtfully. I wrote a little book a few years ago that might help you. When we go back to the office, I'll see if I can find a copy for you. Jethro's eyes flashed with pleasure, but the editor held up a warning hand. Don't get your hopes up too high. This isn't a storybook or a history book either. It's dull, very dull. I warn you that you'll have to dig to get anything out of it. He smiled wryly as he spoke. My effort was especially for Jasper County, and it didn't exactly set Jasper on fire. In fact, it didn't even raise a smoke, although a few people have profited by it. I think maybe you and your sister may get something out of it. Jethro flushed. He wished that he could find suitable words of appreciation, but he suddenly felt a great shyness about saying anything in the presence of this man, who had actually written a book about correct speech. They ate for a while in silence. Ross Milton was thoughtful, and Jethro was soon completely absorbed in the pleasure of oven-cooked food that seemed delicate and tempting in contrast to the coarse fare to which he was accustomed. He ate slowly, hoping that in days to come he'd be able to remember how good each mouthful had been. When he finally pushed his plate aside and attacked the apple pie, he wondered that anything so unspeakably delicious could ever have come his way. "Enjoying your dinner?" the editor asked after a while. "This dinner's been a real fine treat for me, Mr. Milton." "That's good." Mr. Milton leaned forward in his chair a little, and Jethro had the impression that he was anxious about something. "You're starting for home as soon as we've finished eating, aren't you?" "I allow to." Milton hesitated a little. "That man who caused the trouble in the store a while ago lives out west of Rose Hill. That's on your road home, isn't it?" Jethro nodded. It had been pleasant to forget that affair in the store for a while. "He's quite capable of making trouble over this business of your brother. You must keep out of his way as much as possible." "I know, I don't like him." "Neither do I. He loves violence, so as long as there's no danger in it for himself, the way he loves whiskey. He joined a mob to murder his own grandmother." The editor frowned as he tapped tobacco into the bowl of his pipe. "I'm pretty sure that he can't tear himself away from the saloon until late this afternoon, so I'd like to see you get started early. Do you have any more chores to do?" "Nothing except to pick up a newspaper from Mr. Roscoe." "All right. The St. Louis papers should be up from Olney by now. We'll get one at my office." He mentioned to Mrs. Hiles, and she came over to collect for their meals. She brought another wedge of pie in a brown bag and handed it to Jethro. "This is for you in case you don't get home in time for supper," she said. "I took it as a real compliment the way you plowed into that first piece." At the newspaper office, Jethro picked up one of the papers while Ross Milton hunted for his book. A cartoon caught his eye. It showed an outraged McClellan falling head over heels from the top rung of a ladder marked General-in-Chief to a lower one labeled Army of Potomac only, while a stern-faced Lincoln stood close by and dusted his hands. Here was something to tell Pa. Matt's anger against McClellan had been growing by the week. Jethro remembered Shad's words when they had talked together only a few weeks before. "I would have guessed that McClellan was worth a dozen Grants." When the editor finally returned with the book, he extended it to Jethro with a grin. "Here you are, Creighton. This book is yours if you can use it. We won't expect miracles, but it might just happen that you'll get some good from it." They shook hands, and Jethro felt good as he walked down the street to the hitching post where the young man from the newspaper office had tied his team. When he was in the seat and ready to leave, he looked back. Ross Milton, standing between his crutches in the doorway, waved to him. The team trotted briskly out of town, across the bridge spanning the river, and on up the road between meadows that seemed to have grown a little brighter since morning. The bag of coffee was at his feet, the wedge of pie, the book, and the newspaper were placed safely on the seat beside him. He thought with satisfaction of the things he would have to tell Jenny and his parents that evening. He pushed the scene at the store to the back of his mind, but the dinner with Ross Milton, the kindness of Mrs. Hiles, and the gift of a book actually written by the editor himself, these were the tidbits with which the traveler could reward his family's hours of waiting for his return. He did not know how much he would tell about the ugly words of Guy Wortman and the others who were ready to believe that Matt Creighton was a copperhead because of Bill's actions. It would worry his parents, Jethro knew. They had heard of incidents downstate, a family murdered because they were suspected of being Southern sympathizers, an abolitionist family attacked in the middle of the night and their house fired by men who hated what their victims stood for. Southern Illinois was beginning to feel the tumult that had rocked Missouri. There was a tradition of a free state in Illinois, a tradition long since established with the opening of the Northwest Territory, but it was being challenged by thousands whose ties with the South were close and of long standing. Jasper County was predominantly Northern in its sympathies, but there were many whose loyalty was secretly with the South or suspected of being there. Now the Creightons were one of those families, a Copperhead family whose youngest boy spoke up for a brother who had gone south. The ones who wanted to hate, the sullen ones with pig's eyes, and the angry ones who loved violence as they loved whiskey would not care to remember that Tom and Eb, and now John and Chad, were in the Union Army. A man in the store had said, "I don't think you'd round up a mob so easy to go against him if it was a matter between Trav Berto and the Creightons this year." At first the miles seemed to pass faster than they had on the trip into town, but for all that Jethro began to grow tired after 3 hours or so had gone by. It had been a long time since 4 o'clock that morning when he had crawled out of bed at his father's first call, and the excitement of the day, as well as its length, had taken toll of his energy. He found himself nodding a little now and then, as the slow creak of the wheels invited sleep, and he had to shake himself briskly and to talk aloud for a while, when the monotony became overpowering. The sun was getting low by the time he reached the ruins of what had been the county's first schoolhouse, a landmark known as the 8 Mile Point north of Newton. It was early twilight when he reached the Burdo place, where the wagon that Jethro had seen in front of the general store in Newton now stood in the cluttered barn lot. 2 dogs rushed out toward Jethro's team, barking shrilly and snapping at the heels of the horses. A woman came to the door of the cabin and stood, half lost in the shadows as she looked out at the passing wagon. By twilight, the place seemed even grimmer than it had that morning. The 2-mile stretch of woods road was just ahead, the hardest 2 miles of the trip if one considered the terrain. But to Jethro, the several yards along the doorway and barn lot of Dave Burdo's place were full of sinister threat that made the woods road a welcome relief. When it curved among the trees and the Burdo cabin was lost to sight, he breathed easier and shifted himself stiffly on the seat as he prepared for the ordeal of mud holes and jutting tree stumps in the road ahead. The curve, however, was no sooner rounded than Jethro discovered that the vague dread he had experienced in passing the cabin had now become a reality. A man stood among the trees at the edge of the road, a saddled horse at his side. As Jethro approached, he walked slowly out as if he'd known the wagon would soon be along and had been waiting. Jethro saw that it was Dave Burdo. With a curt gesture, he motioned Jethro to stop. "Like to ride with you a piece," he muttered, and climbed over the wheel and into the seat without raising his eyes to the boy's face. He led his own horse by a strap. Jethro shrank from the great bulk beside him with fear and revulsion. He did not dare look at Burdo, but he remembered the sullen pig-like eyes that had stared at him in the store that morning. He remembered, too, hearing usually mild Ed Turner speak in loud anger about Dave Burdo a few weeks after Mary's death. "Decency ain't in him," Ed had declared. "He's had a nary word of human feeling for what happened to that little girl. Nary word of thanks that Matt saved his worthless boy from his neighbors. He's more of a dumb brute than a man." Dave Burdo was as silent as the darkness that was drawing in around them. There was no sound but the creaking of the wagon as it floundered through the sour-smelling mud and over mammoth tree roots. The air held a damp chill, as if the sun that had given a pale, late winter brightness to the streets of Newton had been too weak to penetrate the dense branches above the woods road. The team was tired, the going slow, and a quarter of a mile was covered in only something less than an eternity. Jethro did not actually visualize the grim possibilities that faced him. He was still too much a child, still insufficiently acquainted with violence, to believe that bodily harm could possibly come to him. Ugly things happened, it was true, but to people who were distant, unknown people, not to someone named Jethro Creighton. He was afraid, but his fear was vague, and anger was as strong as fear when he thought of the precious bag of coffee and the little gifts. Gifts were as rare for him as comforts or luxuries. The book, the wedge of pie, the handful of Sam Gardner's candy. There was the team, too, and the wagon. If a thieving Burdo took these, what could a boy who had been trusted with them say to his father? "You just have to keep a level head and use gumption," he had said confidently the night before. He tried to hold himself firm, but after a while the strain became too great, and a shudder shook his body with sudden violence. The silent man at his side turned then and looked at him for the first time. "Got no call to be afeared," he said roughly. "I ain't aiming to hurt you none." Jethro didn't answer, and they drove on in silence again, for so long that he was startled when Dave Burdo spoke again. His voice was less rough this time, and it held the resonance of anger and sadness that made Jethro remember the stories he had heard of mad old John Brown. "There be things that's evil in these woods tonight. I seed evil pass in my place a while ago, comin' in from the shortcut road to town and reelin' in the saddle. I heard evil braggin' in the saloon today about layin' for a young'un on his way home." He reached over and took the reins from Jethro's hands. "I'd best drive till we're out of the brush," he added. "We're getting close to the place where some poisonous snake might strike quick." The world was turning upside down for Jethro. He felt as if he were someone else, someone looking from far off at a boy who had started from home with a team and a wagon on a March morning that was at least 100 years ago. When he tried to speak, he found that his voice, like his identity, had gone too. His lips worked as they had often seemed to work in a bad dream, to form the words he wanted to say, but no sound passed them, and there was nothing to do but sit quietly while his mind floundered in the uncertainties that beset it. At a point near the north end of the woods road, there was a bridge spanning the ravine that cut a deep, jagged gash across the road and through the fields beyond. As they approached the bridge, Jethro saw the dim outline of a horse beside a tree. Dave Burdo saw it too, and he leaned forward in the seat, his hands tightening on the lines and the strap by which he led his own horse beside the wagon. At the bridge, the thing happened quickly and was over without a word being spoken by either the attacker or the attacked. A man leapt from the ravine when the wagon was midway across the bridge, and, running up beside the team, laid a long whip across the backs of the horses. There was a bad moment on the horses as the horses plunged and kicked, and as Burdo's horse responded to the fight of the team. Seconds later, the tethered horse at the roadside broke away and galloped off in the darkness ahead of the wagon. The thing was over quickly with Dave Burdo's strong hands on the reins. It had been a close brush with tragedy, but as the horses became quiet again and the event became as routine in Jethro's mind as the tilting of the wagon had been that morning, it would be a while before he would grasp the full terror of the thing that had happened. There was no word between the two in the wagon when the danger was over. Both man and boy seemed to be in tacit agreement that the attack at the bridge was a closed incident, a thing for which they felt a solid indifference. Jethro realized that he had clung to Dave Burdo's arm during the worst of the moment, and he drew aside. Shortly after the incident at the bridge, the light from Jake Roscoe's cabin could be seen through the trees. The old man was waiting at his gate when the wagon finally came up. "Are you young Creighton?" he called out. "Did you bring me my paper?" Burdo stopped the team, and Jethro handed the paper down across the wheel. He found that his lips were still too numb for speech, and he wanted desperately to be beyond earshot of the old man's plaintive questioning. "Who is that? Who is that with you?" Roscoe asked, peering up through the darkness. Jethro could only shake his head, and Dave Burdo did not speak. The team started on, no less communicative than the two figures in the wagon, and the old man was left muttering angrily at his gate. A little distance beyond Roscoe's place, Dave Burdo stopped the team again and prepared to climb down from the wagon. "Wortman can't follow you. You can get on by yourself now." He jumped from the top of the wheel to the ground and turned his horse's head to the south. Jethro managed the words, "I'm obliged," but Dave Burdo made no sign of having heard him. He mounted his horse and, without looking around, started back over the road they had just traveled. Jethro watched horse and rider for as long as he could see them. Then he flipped the lines across the backs of the team. There were still 4 full miles to cover, and he was weak with a deep weariness that seemed to penetrate every muscle of his body. His head swam in a way that frightened him, and to protect himself against the danger of falling off the high seat, he slid down into the bed of the wagon and leaned against the side. The horses needed no guiding now. They knew they were on the last lap of the day's journey. There was a dim new moon, which he hadn't seen while he was in the woods, and Jethro watched it dully as home came closer, step by step. His thoughts skirted the danger that had threatened him. He wondered instead of if Guy Wortman's horse had run away for good and all. He wondered, too, what Dave Burdo would say to the woman who had watched Jethro from the shadowy door of her cabin. Then he slept a little and wakened suddenly to feel about the seat and bed, locating each parcel that he had brought with him from town. When at last he saw the light from the kitchen window at home, he urged the horses to a trot, and under the cover of the wagon's rattling, the sound of a few sobs amounted to almost nothing. A long rectangle of light appeared in the dark outline of the cabin while he was still some distance down the road. He knew then that his approach had been heard, that the door was open, and that someone was coming outside to welcome him. At home, the relief of those who had waited was obvious in the excitement of their welcome. When the parcels were carried inside and the team cared for, Jethro sat beside his father at the table with Jenny and Ellen facing him and waiting for all the news of his trip to town. They noticed his pallor, and Ellen's eyes were tender as she recognized the signs of tears, but they would not shame him by asking him if the trip had been too hard for him. They spoke instead of his purchases. He'd shown good judgment in the things he'd bought. They congratulated him on being able to count for every penny of the money earned through sales and expended for their needs. Jethro chose carefully from among the day's happenings those things that he wished to tell them. He related parts of his conversation with old Jake Roscoe. He told them of meeting the editor in Sam Gardner's store, and that the young man named Charlie had looked after the team while Jethro had gone to the restaurant for dinner with Mr. Milton. He made them taste Mrs. Hiles' pie and share Sam Gardner's candy. He showed them the book on English usage and told them about the cartoon in the paper relating to General McClellan's late demotion. He spoke slowly and a little wearily, but they were too much interested to guess that he was holding back some news of keener interest. After a while, Ellen held out her hand to him. You're spent, Jethro. I can see it in your face. Let's all get to our beds and talk the rest of your trip in the morning." Jenny pushed her chair back, and Matt started to rise, but Jethro sat in his place and motioned toward the others to sit again. "There's more I have to tell you before we sleep," he said. There was a catch in his voice, and they all looked at him with anxious eyes. Then he stretched his arms out on the table and, with a long sigh, began his story. "I didn't tell you this, but in the store this morning there was a man named Guy Wortman, and there was another man, Trav Bertle's pa.